Okay, I'm Dan Baker. This is Bulbasaur the Cat, and tonight I'm reading Marxism versus Identity Politics, which is a publication of the Revolutionary Communists of America, of which I am a sympathizer and a financial sustainer. And this channel is called Comrade Meow's Audiobooks. I'm trying to share communist ideology and as much literature as I can, whether it's me reading it or listening to another audiobook while I do my daily routine. So I have a very humble setup here. There's just this wireless charging stand holding the phone, and I'm live streaming from my apartment with my phone. So please like, share, and subscribe. Marxism versus Identity Politics. This document, after a thorough discussion at all levels of the international Marxist tendency over the past year, was approved unanimously by the IMT World Congress held at the end of July 2018, with the original title, Marxist Theory and the Struggle Against Alien Class Ideas. Its aim is to draw a line between Marxism and a set of idealistic postmodern alien class ideas, which have affected for some time a layer of activists in academic circles, who are also being used in a reactionary manner within the international workers' movement. This document is a call to intensify the theoretical and political struggle against these ideas and methods. Note, the IMT was the prior name of the organization which founded the Revolutionary Communist International in 2024. RCA is the US section. Marxism versus Identity Politics. The crisis of capitalism has exposed many deep-seated currents of opposition to the existing society, its values, its morality, and its intolerable injustices and oppression. The central contradiction in society remains the antagonism between wage labor and capital. However, oppression takes many different forms, some of them considerably older and more deep-rooted than wage slavery. Among the most universal and painful forms of oppression is the oppression of women in a male-dominated world. The rebellion of women against these monstrous oppression is of fundamental importance in the struggle for socialist revolution, which cannot be attained without the full participation of women in the fight against capitalism. For centuries, the stability of class society has established a solid point of support in the family, that is to say, on the enslavement of women to men. This form of slavery is far older than capitalism, as Engels explained. The emergence of the patriarchal family represents the, quote, world historic defeat of the female sex. The man took command in the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. This male domination and the subservient position of women in society and the family is now being questioned, along with all the other barbarous institutions that we have inherited from the past. Why should women continue to tolerate the position of second-class citizens? The questioning of the role of women in society and the family has serious revolutionary implications and can lead to a revolutionary questioning of capitalist society itself. The senile degeneration of capitalism leads to a serious deterioration of the conditions of all workers, but it imposes a particularly harsh condition on women and young people. Many find themselves denied access to adequate work and housing. Single parents and their children are condemned to poverty and endless hardship. For many, even to have a roof over their heads becomes difficult or even impossible. In the workplace, women suffer from unequal pay to all manner of harassment and abuse. The situation has become completely intolerable. It is possible to judge the level of civilization of a given culture by its treatment of women, children, and old people. From this point of view, modern capitalism is far less civilized, more inhumane and cruel than earlier forms of society. The level of alienation and degradation of human beings, the indifference to human suffering, and obscene egotism have reached levels unknown in human history. The degeneration of capitalist society reveals itself in the crudest form in the epidemic of violence against women. In India, Pakistan, Argentina, Mexico, and other countries, this has expressed itself in an unprecedented number of abductions, rapes, and murders. But in societies that like to describe themselves as civilized, similar horrors are being perpetrated against women and children. These are revolting symptoms of the sickness of a society that is rotten, ripe for overthrow. A growing feeling of alienation, injustice, and oppression is feeding a general movement of rebellion among women against the existing state of affairs. The awakening of millions of women, especially the younger generation, who feel a burning indignation about the discrimination, oppression, and humiliation to which they are subjected under an unjust system, in a profoundly progressive and revolutionary phenomenon that we should celebrate and support with the utmost enthusiasm. It goes without saying that Marxists stand 100% in favor of the complete emancipation of women. There cannot be the slightest hesitation, ambiguity, or doubt about this. We must fight against the oppression of women at all levels, not just in words but in deeds. Under no circumstances can we allow the impression that this is somehow a secondary issue that can be subsumed under the general category of the class struggle. It would be fatal for the cause of Marxism if women believe that Marxists are prepared to postpone the struggle of their rights until the victory of socialism. This is entirely false and a vicious caricature of revolutionary Marxism. While it is true that the complete emancipation of women and men can only be achieved in a classless society, it is equally true that such a society can only be achieved through the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. Women cannot be expected to put to one side their immediate, pressing demands and await the arrival of socialism. The victory of the socialist revolution is unthinkable without the day-to-day struggle for advance under capitalism. Marxists must fight for even the smallest reforms that can serve to improve the living standards of the working people under capitalism for two reasons. In the first place, we are fighting to defend the workers against exploitation, to defend living standards of the working people, democratic rights, and the most elementary conditions of a civilized existence, to defend culture and civilization against barbarism. Secondly, the most importantly, it is only through the experience of day-to-day struggle that the class can acquire a sense of its own power, to develop its organizational strength and raise its collective conscience to the level demanded by history. To demand, as sectarians and dogmatists have done, that the workers should set aside their day-to-day demands in the interests of the revolution is the height of stupidity. It would doom us to complete sterility and isolation. On that road, the socialist revolution would forever remain an impossible mirage. In the same way, the struggle for the advancement of women against reactionary male chauvinism, for progressive reforms and complete equality in the social, political, and economic fields is a fundamental duty of all genuine revolutionary Marxists. On March 8, 2018, we saw a graphic indication of the colossal revolutionary potential of the women's movement in Spain when 5.3 million people, both men and women, responded to the call for strike action. Hundreds of thousands participated in demonstrations all over Spain. This magnificent mobilization was held under the banner of feminism, although it also reflected a colossal mood of discontent that has built up in Spanish society on a huge range of issues. For example, the pensioners, who also staged mass demonstrations around this time. If you ever see me doing this before I pet the cats, that's me asking permission to touch them. When I go like this and they move away, I don't bother them. The central issues, however, were specifically related to the oppression of women, the wage differential, violence and harassment of women in the family, at work, in education, the burden of housework, etc. This was exemplified by the monstrous case of gang rape in Pamplona and the scandalous conduct of the right-wing judges, which was a clear proof of the rottenness and reactionary nature of the entire Spanish state, police, and judiciary, all of which were inherited directly from the Franco dictatorship as a result of the betrayal of the so-called democratic transition. It is an elementary truth of Marxism that any mass movement, it is necessary to distinguish carefully between the reactionary and progressive elements. That was the tremendously progressive element in this extraordinary movement is beyond all question. We not only supported it, but did so energetically and enthusiastically. But it would be completely incorrect and one-sided to emphasize this aspect of the movement and ignore the other side. What was the role of the leaders of this movement? They demanded that there would be women-only pickets and separate women-only blocks at the demonstration and wanted to allow only purple flags. The strike was supposed to be followed by women only, with men taking their place at work. That is to say, acting as strike breakers. This would have severely restricted the scope of the movement on March 8th and rendered the general strike utterly impossible. This was completely against the interests of the movement and clearly reflected the narrow outlook and reactionary and divisive policies of the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie feminists. Our Spanish comrades intervened energetically in this mass movement and got a very sympathetic hearing. Although we do not call ourselves feminists, we make it very clear that we stand wholeheartedly in favor of the struggle for the emancipation of women and are fighting shoulder to shoulder with all those who are struggling against oppression. In all demonstrations and meetings, we found no hint of any prejudice against us, at least from the great majority of women who regard themselves as feminists. Is it true, that feminism is not a school of thought or a theory? That depends how you look at it. It is perfectly true that the millions who participated in the strikes and demonstrations in Spain on March 8th, under the banner of feminism, had nothing whatsoever to do with the feminist prejudices of the leadership. They were instinctively fighting against reactionary phenomena that filled them with righteous indignation. That is the starting point for revolutionary developments. However, the leadership of that movement was in the hands of the bourgeois and petty bourgeois feminists, who most certainly represent a school of thought and a definite ideology that is fundamentally opposed not only to Marxism, but essentially to the interests of the struggle for the emancipation of women itself. Nowadays, the concept of feminism has become so broad as to become virtually meaningless. All of a sudden, everyone has become a feminist. Even the reactionary politicians of the PP political party, I suppose, describe themselves as feminists. Because you see, they have women ministers. Every one of them are reactionary and as corrupt as their male counterparts. The new second-hand version of the PP, Ciudadanos, is particularly insistent that it is naturally feminist. But the reality of the bourgeois feminism was glaringly exposed by the fact that the party leader, Albert Rivera himself, stated that they could not support the feminist strike on March 8th because it was anti-capitalist. We also note that these politicians of Ciudadanos, who finally decided to turn up on the demonstrations, were booed by the demonstrators and expelled them from the movement. Even among the most advanced sectors, there are all kinds of confusions and illusions, which are deliberately led by the bourgeois and petty bourgeois theoreticians of feminism. Another idea which is widespread about the transversal character of the movement, that is, that the movement should involve all women, regardless of class, political ideology, etc. With a friendly and patient approach, we can combat these prejudices and clarify the confusion, but we must avoid mixing up our banners. In order to win over the best elements, it is necessary to maintain a firm and clear Marxist position at all times. It is necessary for us to call ourselves is it necessary for us to call ourselves feminists in order to link up with this important layer? All our experience indicates that this is not the case. The following example is of great symptomatic interest. In Antequera, Malaga, we organized a meeting about the March 8th feminist strikes with several female speakers from the left wing and trade union organizations. One of our female comrades spoke at the meeting, explaining that she was a trade unionist and a revolutionary Marxist and outlining our program. At the end of the meeting, a group of young women immediately approached her at her stall and said they wanted to get involved. These young women would obviously regard themselves as feminists, but they had no problem whatsoever identifying themselves with the program of Marxism. If our comrades had adopted a sectarian and dogmatic attitude to the movement, they would have undoubtedly have alienated themselves from women such as these. There is no question of Marxists adopting such a foolish approach as that, but at the same time, we must adopt a principled attitude, making it very clear that we are Marxists who are fighting for women's rights, and that we consider that this important struggle can only be waged successfully as part of a general revolutionary class struggle for a root and branch change in society. Here we have a very clear analogy, which is the attitude of Marxists to the national question. Do we support the demand for the independence of Catalonia from the Spanish state? Yes, we do. But we do so while explaining that on the capitalist basis, independence will solve nothing. We stand for the Catalan Workers' Republic, which in the future could form part of the Socialist Federation of Iberian Peoples. But do we call, therefore, ourselves Marxist nationalists? Certainly not. We are not nationalists, but proletarian internationalists. It is precisely part of our revolutionary internationalist program to support the fight of the Catalan people to free themselves from the tutelage of the reactionary Spanish state, the rotten PP government, and the undemocratic monarchy inherited from Franco. But the phrase Marxist nationalist is a contradiction in terms. Again, our experience in Catalonia indicates that it is not necessary to use such confusing language in order to convince the best and most revolutionary elements of the workers and youth, many of whom are beginning to understand the limited and reactionary nature of bourgeois and petty bourgeois nationalism, and seeking a more radical, revolutionary, and class alternative. In the last analysis, all questions, the question of national oppression, the struggle for women's emancipation, the fight against racism, have a class character. That is the fundamental dividing line that separates Marxism from nationalism, feminism, and every other manifestation of the struggle against oppression. The March 8 movement in Spain only serves to underline these points. The mass movement against the oppression of women has a tremendous revolutionary potential, but this potential can only reach its full extent to the degree that the movement goes beyond the narrow limitations of bourgeois and petty bourgeois feminism and links up with a general movement of the working class to change society. Our task is to assist it to make the necessary transition. While actively participating in such movements and attempting to win over the best elements, we must at all times bring out sharply the class divisions that exist in all these movements, basing ourselves on what is progressive in them, while exposing and criticizing the bourgeois and petty bourgeois elements in the leadership. The importance of theory. Engels stressed the significance of theory for the revolutionary movement. He pointed out that there were not two forms of struggle, political and economic, but three, placing the theoretical struggle on par with the first two. Lenin emphatically agreed with Engels' view when he wrote in What Is to Be Done the following quote, "Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. This idea cannot be insisted upon too strongly at a time when the fashionable preaching of opportunism goes hand in hand with an infatuation for the narrowest form of practical activity. The prior contradiction for the building of a genuine Marxist international is the defense of the basic principles of Marxism, which implies an implacable struggle against all kinds of revisionist ideas, which in essence reflect the pressures of alien classes on the workers' movement." Marx and Engels waged an implacable struggle against all attempts to water down the ideas of the movement, pitilessly exposing the false theories, first of the utopian socialists, then of the followers of Proudhon and Bakunin, and finally against the opportunists, catheter socialists, like Düring, the clever university professors who, under the pretense of bringing socialism up to date, tried to strip the revolutionary essence of Marxism. Lenin, from the very beginning of his revolutionary activity, declared war on the, quote, young people who, like Düring, claimed that certain of Marx's ideas were out of date and needed to be revised, demanding freedom of criticism. He showed that this so-called opposition to dogmatism was merely a pretext for people who wished to replace the revolutionary content of Marxism with the opportunistic policy of small deeds, a trend that later crystallized into Menshevism. So these were offshoots that basically were attempts of the ruling class to water down an extremely effective program. And you see this in the form of things like these days, the Rojava Revolution, for example, that I took part in, rebranding socialism as democratic confederalism, which, it's a good program, it's working for now, but the roots are in socialism, they're in Marxism. And somewhat related to that, in the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK in Turkey, they recently disarmed after having long ago abandoned Marxism for democratic confederalism. And I'm worried that the Rojava Revolution will suffer the same fate because they've abandoned Marxism in favor of a new synthesized ideology that basically is like a beast that has lost its fangs. If you give up your arms, you give up your weapons, you're just setting the stage for defeat at the hands of the state. Continuing on, later in the period of reaction that followed the defeat of the 1905 revolution, the mood of despair among layers of the middle-class intelligentsia found an echo inside Bolshevism, when a section of the leadership, Bogdanov and Lunarchensky, began to reflect the fashionable philosophy of subjective idealism, called Neo-Kantianism, and mysticism. It is no accident that Lenin wrote one of his most important philosophical works, Materialism and Imperial Criticism, to combat these ideas. We must add that Lenin was prepared to break with the majority of the Bolshevik leaders on these philosophical questions, which were also connected to ultra-left politics. Before his death, Trotsky was engaged in a very sharp struggle against the petty bourgeois tendency in the American SWP, Bernin and Schachmann, on the question of the class nature of the Soviet Union. Trotsky explained that their false position rejecting the defense of the USSR was, on the one hand, a reflection of the pressure of alien classes, the petty bourgeois intellectuals, on the SWP, on the other hand, a rejection of Marxist philosophy dialectics. From these few examples, we can see the vital role that the struggle for theory has always played in the history of our movement. What sets the International Marxist Tendency, IMT, apart from all other tendencies is above all our painstaking attitude to theory. And I'll stop for a moment to reiterate that the IMT is now the Revolutionary Communist International, and the Revolutionary Communists of America is the American branch of the Revolutionary Communist International. Over a century and a half, Marxism has built a scientific program upon the laws that govern the movement of capitalist society. This is a colossal conquest, which we must defend against all attacks, whether from the right or the, quote, left wing. The IMT, which is now the RCI, has a proud tradition in this respect. In a period when many were abandoning the ideas of Marxism, including many former communists, we remained implacable in our defense of the fundamental ideas of Marxism, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky. In Defense of Marxism website has established a sterling reputation for its theoretical clarity. This is what has set us apart from the other tendencies in the labor movement. We have always refused to make concessions to revisionists who reflect the pressures of bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideology. We remain completely impervious to the deafening chorus that demanded new ideas in place of the allegedly old-fashioned ideas of Marx, which are in reality the most modern ideas, the only ideas that can explain the present crisis and show a way out of it. The decay of culture. There are periods in history that are characterized by moods of pessimism, doubts, and despair, which are periods having lost faith in the existing society and its ideology. People search for a viable alternative, which is revolutionary of necessity. But the old society, though it is dying on its feet, still exerts a powerful influence. No longer commanding positive support, it emanates negative moods, as a corpse emits a bad odor. In the days of its youth, the bourgeois believed in progress because despite all of its brutal and exploitative features, capitalism played a very progressive role in developing the productive forces, thus laying the material basis for a higher stage of human society, socialism. In the past, when the bourgeoisie was still capable of playing a progressive role, it had a revolutionary ideology. It produced great and original thinkers, Locke and Hobbes, Rousseau and Diderot, Kant and Hegel, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, Newton and Darwin. But the intellectual production of the bourgeoisie in the period of decline displays all the evidence of advanced senile decay. The postmodernist confusion that passes for philosophy in our times is in itself a confession of the most abject intellectual bankruptcy. The intellectual snobs who strut around the university campuses with airs of great superiority treat the philosophers of the past with contempt. But the poverty of content of this so-called philosophy is so glaring that the postmodern flea crackers immediately shrink into insignificance when compared to any of those great thinkers. I believe the term flea cracker refers to people who sell a flea circus, which is, a little scam type hustle situation. Postmodernism denies the concept of historical progress in general, for the simple reason that the society that spawned it is incapable of any progress. The mere fact that the postmodernist narrative could be taken seriously as a new philosophy is in itself a crushing condemnation of the theoretical bankruptcy of capitalism and the bourgeois intelligentsia in the epoch of imperialist decay. In the words of Hegel, by the little which can thus satisfy the needs of the human spirit, we can measure the extent of its loss. This is no accident. The present epoch is characterized by ideological confusion, apostasy, disintegration, and dispersal. Under these conditions, a mood of pessimism seizes the intelligentsia, which yesterday saw capitalism as a never-ending source of careers and the guarantee of a comfortable living standard. In order to save the bankers, capitalism is prepared to sacrifice the rest of society. Millions of people are faced with an uncertain future. The general ruin does not affect only the working class, but extends to the middle class, the students and professors, the researchers and technicians, the musicians and artists, lecturers and doctors. There is a growing ferment in the middle class which finds its most acute expression in the intelligentsia. This is a class which, crushed between the big capitalists and the working class, keenly feels the precariousness of its situation. While some are being radicalized to the left, the majority, particularly in academia, are dominated by moods of pessimism and uncertainty. When they say there is no such thing as progress, what they mean is the present society gives us absolutely no guarantee that tomorrow will not be worse than today. And that is quite correct. But instead of drawing the conclusion that it is necessary to fight to overthrow the present system that has led humanity into a historical blind alley and threatens the very future of civilization and culture, if not the human race itself, they cower in a corner, retreating into themselves, while salving their uneasy conscience with the comforting thought that there is no such thing as progress anyway. Out of this narrow-minded prejudice, lack of vision, and intellectual cowardice, other, more practical conclusions inevitably follow. A rejection of the revolution in favor of small deeds, like pettifogging arguments over words and narratives. A retreat into subjectivity, a denial of the class struggle, elevating, quote, my personal oppression over yours, which in turn leads to an increasing compartmentalization and ultimately atomization of the movement. There are, of course, some differences between the situation today and the ideas that Lenin combated with such ferocity in 1908. But the differences are merely of form. The content is very similar, if not identical, and the practical consequences are 100% reactionary. An age of apostasy. Lenin was always honest about problems and difficulties. His slogan was always, say what it is. Sometimes the truth is unpalatable, but we need to state the truth always. The reality is that, for a combination of circumstances, objective and subjective, the revolutionary movement has been thrown back, and the forces of genuine Marxism reduced to a small minority. That is the truth, and those who deny it are merely deceiving themselves and others. In recent decades, the shrill demand for a revision of the fundamental postulates of Marxism has become deafening. Marxism, we are informed, is synonymous with dogmatism or even Stalinism. This is desperate search for modern ideas that will allegedly supersede the old discrediting ideas of Marxism is not at all an accident. The working class does not live in isolation from other classes, and inevitably comes under the influence of alien classes and ideologies. We also live and work in society, and are constantly under these pressures and moods. The general moods of society can also penetrate the working class and its organizations. In periods where the class is not generally moving, the pressures of the bourgeoisie, and especially the petty bourgeoisie, are intensified. After the long period when the workers fell into temporary inactivity, the petty bourgeois elements came to the fore of the labor movement, elbowing the workers to one side. The workers' voice is drowned out by the chorus of the, quote, clever people, who have lost the will to fight, themselves and are anxious to persuade the workers that revolution brings only tears and disappointment. Following the fall of Stalinism, there was a general mood of confusion and ideological backsliding. Many people dropped out of the communist movement, and cynicism and skepticism became fashionable. Disillusioned with the betrayals of the socialist and communist parties, left-wing intellectuals reacted, not by breaking with Stalinism and reformism, but by moving away from the ideas of Marxism and revolutionary socialism altogether. Many, particularly the ex-Stalinists, abandoned Marxism and the struggle for socialism and set off on quixotic quests for the new methods, which, like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, they never find. For those who don't know, quixotic refers to Don Quixote, who was fighting windmills because he was insane, and he thought they were dragons. To these aging cynics, all of their youthful dreams of revolution now seem like foolishness, the quote, sins of youth, as the arch-revisionist Heinz Dieterich likes to call them. And one feels a powerful urge to settle accounts with one's past, to correct these useful peccadillos, and thus to encourage the new generation from following the road of sin. The organization of the labor movement was gradually pushed to the right. The workers were elbowed to one side by the middle-class careerists who seized the leading positions. This, in turn, caused many workers to fall into inactivity, leading to an ever greater increase of the petty bourgeois element. In such periods, the voice of the worker is drowned out by the reformist chorus of innovations such as new realism, new labor, and so on and so forth. The ideas of the petty bourgeois become predominant. The ideas of class politics and revolutionary socialism are proclaimed as old-fashioned. In place of dogmatic Marxism, we have many, many different ideas: pacifism, feminism, environmentalism. In fact, any ism you like, except, of course, socialism and Marxism. Trotsky dealt with such a phenomenon when he wrote the Transitional Program in 1938. The tragic defeat suffered by the world proletariat over a long period of years doomed the official organizations to yet another conservatism and simultaneously sent disillusioned petty bourgeois revolutionists in pursuit of new ways. As always during epochs of reaction and decay, quacks and charlatans appear on all sides, desirous of revising the whole course of revolutionary thought. Instead of learning from the past, they reject it. Some discovered the inconsistency of Marxism, others renounced the downfall of Bolshevism. There are those who put responsibility above revolutionary doctrine for the mistakes and crimes of those who betrayed it. Others who curse the medicine because it does not guarantee an instantaneous and miraculous cure. The more daring promise to discover a panacea and, in anticipation, recommend the halting of the class struggle. A good many prophets of new morals are preparing to regenerate the labor movement with the help of ethical homeopathy. The majority of these apostles have succeeded in becoming themselves moral invalids before arriving on the field of battle. Thus, under the aspect of new ways, old recipes, long since buried in the archives of pre-Marxian socialism, are offered to the proletariat. Leon Trotsky, The Transitional Program. Matters today are no better with the ultra-left sects, who eke out a miserable existence on the margins of the labor movement. Though they invoke Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky in every other sentence, they do not even bother to reprint their works, preferring more, quote, modern or postmodern ideas that they have taken over uncritically from the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie. The Mandalite sect, the so-called United Sectarian of the Fourth International, is the clearest example of this. On the other extreme, sects like the Tafiites, CWI, and SWP in Britain, the Lutte Ouvrière in France, fall back into the swamp of economism, which Lenin sharply condemned. The demagogic mask of workerism and rejection of students and intellectuals as a whole is merely a facade to disguise contempt for theory and the substitution of revolutionary politics for so-called practical politics and bread-and-butter issues. It is hard to see which deviation from genuine Marxism is worse. New ideas for old. In the tale of Aladdin, an evil wizard dresses up as a street vendor and offers new shiny lamps as a free trade for old ones. Aladdin's princess foolishly accepts the offer, and so loses the power of the genie of the lamp. It is an entertaining tale, but contains a serious message. It is foolish to exchange things of proven value for bright, shiny gold, which turns out to be illusory. It is ironic that precisely at this time, when the crisis of capitalism has completely vindicated Marxism, there is a veritable race to the left, on the left, to throw Marxist theory overboard, as if it were so much useless ballast. The former communists no longer even speak of socialism and have consigned the writing of Marx and Engels to the dustbin. The ideas of revolutionary Marxism are presented as old-fashioned and irrelevant. The middle class of intellectuals and progressives fall over themselves in their attempt to discredit Marxism. The general atmosphere of ideological confusion, questioning of Marxist orthodoxy, and rejection of theory can have a pernicious effect, even in our own ranks. This is not the first time we have seen such things. These anti-revolutionary reformist tendencies have always been present in the movement. As we have seen, Marx, Lenin, Engels, and Trotsky all had to deal with the same campaign for, quote, new ideas, which has always been the battle cry of every revisionist from Düring and Bernstein onwards. We have dealt with some of these contemporary alternatives in the book by Alan Woods, Reformism or Revolution, Socialism of the 21st Century, reply to Heinz Diderich. What this incessant quest to revise Marxism reflects is the despondency of the older layer who, demoralized by past defeats and failures, have lost the will to struggle for revolutionary change in practice, but wish to salve their conscience by posing as Marxists who, becoming, quote, older and wiser, have understood that the, quote, new ideas were only after all utopian dreams, with no practical relevance to the present world. The sole purpose of these arguments is to divert the attention of the youth, cause the maximum confusion, and to act as a barrier to prevent the new generations from gaining access to Marxism. It is only the mirror reflection of the campaign of the bourgeoisie against socialism and communism. But it is far more dangerous and damaging than the latter because it is a campaign waged under a false banner. These are things that the CIA does consciously. Its proponents are radically opposed to the revolution in socialism, but they dare not admit this, possibly even to themselves. To what extent they actually believe in the nonsense they write is something that only an expert psychologist can determine. They disguise their reactionary, anti-revolutionary, and anti-socialist message under a thick layer of left and radical phraseology that makes it all the more difficult for most people to identify. The idea of socialism are watered down, revised, or simply dropped. The Marxist tendency is not immune to the pressures of capitalism. The confused and pessimist moods of the middle-class intellectuals can sometimes find an echo within the Marxist movement, where they manifest themselves as a constant attack on stultifying orthodoxy and a constant appeal for, quote, something new, which remind us very much of the siren call of Aladdin's wizard. The dangers of student work. Revolutionary socialists are accustomed to the furious onslaughts against socialism and communism, not only those of the open defenders of capitalism and imperialism, but also the reformists, both of the right and left varieties, and also the so-called radical petty bourgeois intelligentsia, some of whom wish to fight against capitalism, but have not the slightest idea of how to do so. We have laid heavy stress on the importance of student and youth work, and this is giving us very important results, not just in Britain, but also in many other countries, including the US and Canada. We must continue with this orientation for the foreseeable future, but we must also give careful consideration to the way in which it is carried out. It is true that work among students has enormous possibilities for us, but it is equally true that it contains many risks and dangers. We must always keep our eyes open to these dangers in order to avoid very serious consequences. It is necessary to bear in mind that the universities are an alien milieu, full of people from alien classes and heavily under the influence of bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideas. The student milieu contains many overwhelmingly bourgeois and petty bourgeois, which also affects students who are working class origin. In many cases, they are only too anxious to climb up the social ladder and then kick it away, leaving their class far behind them in their rush to become doctors, lawyers, and politicians. This may not always be the case, but all too often it is. The universities are a transmission belt for the spreading of reactionary bourgeois ideas in society. They are veritable hothouses where the bourgeois develop 1,001 weird and wonderful ideas to confuse and mislead the youth and steer them away from revolution. The universities are not temples of learning, but factories for the mass production of ideological defenders of capitalism. In the epoch of the senile decay of capitalism, the universities have become a poisonous swamp in which reactionary ideas are flourishing, and nobody appears to have the guts to tackle them head on. It is the first duty of Marxist students to combat these ideas, not only the openly reactionary ideas of the bourgeois academic establishment, but also the myriad confusing notions of the progressive and radical petty bourgeois elements, quote, radical, who pretend to be against the system, but in practice confine themselves to impotent raging against this or that symptom. An ideological symptom of reaction. It is not an accident either that the proponents of these ideas gained prominence in the universities in the late 1980s or 1990s. As the class struggle receded, an extensive anti-Marxist campaign was undertaken in the universities. Individuals who had been engaged in the revolutionary movement of the 1970s and early 1980s were taken into universities and installed in comfortable jobs for the purpose of attacking Marxism. These attacks were partly of a crude, openly pro-capitalist variety, but others were more veiled and cunning. Intersectionality and identity politics allowed the, quote, left intellectuals a convenient way of deserting the class struggle and abandoning socialism, while continuing to pay lip service to the, quote, progressive causes. It is no accident that these ideas are being pushed throughout the education system today by the ruling class. For example, queer theory can be traced to the wave of postmodernism and other idealist and subjectivist ideas which developed as a reaction against Marxism in recent decades. A recent declassified CIA report from 1985 called France, Defection of the Left Intellectuals, reveals the delight of the intelligence agency with the rightward drift in academia. Quote, Mitterrand's policies, failures, and short-lived alliance with the communists may have accelerated disaffection with his government, but leftist intellectuals have been distancing themselves from the socialism, both the party and the ideology, at least since the 1970s. Led by a group of young renegades from communist ranks who billed themselves as new philosophers, many new left intellectuals have rejected Marxism and developed a deep-rooted antipathy towards the Soviet Union. Anti-Sovietism, in fact, has become the touchstone of legitimacy in leftist circles. Weakening the traditional anti-Americanism of the left intellectuals and following American culture, and even political and economic policies to find new vogue. The report goes on. The bankruptcy of Marxist ideology, disaffection with Marxism as a philosophical system, part of a broader retreat from ideology among intellectuals of all political colors, was the source of the particularly strong and widespread intellectual disillusionment with the traditional left. Raymond Aron worked long hours to discredit his old college roommate Sartre and, through him, the intellectual edifice of French Marxism. Even more effective in undermining Marxism, however, were those intellectuals who set out as true believers to apply Marxist theory in the social sciences, but ended by rethinking and rejecting the entire tradition. Among post-war French historians, the influential school of thought associated with Marc Bloch, Lucien Febvre, and Fernand Braudel has overwhelmed the traditional Marxist historians. The Annales School, as it is known from its principal journal, turned French historical scholarship on its head in the 1950s and 1960s, primarily by challenging and later rejecting the hitherto dominant Marxist theories of historical progress. Although many of its exponents maintain that they are in the Marxist tradition, they mean only that they use Marxism as a critical point of departure for trying to discover the actual patterns of social history. For the most part, they have concluded that Marxist notions of the structure of the past, of social relationships, of patterns of events, and of their influence in the long term are simplistic and invalid. In the field of anthropology, the influential structuralist school associated with Claude Lévi-Strauss, Foucault, and others performed virtually the same mission. Although both structuralism and Annales methodology have fallen on hard times, critics accuse them of being too difficult for the uninitiated to follow. We believe, this is a quote from the CIA, their critical demolition of Marxist influence in the social sciences is likely to endure as a profound contribution to modern scholarship both in France and elsewhere in Western Europe. Similarly, the CIA was involved in covertly supporting a number of anti-totalitarian, quote-unquote, left-wing publications, such as Partisan Review, Der Monat, which published articles by Adorno and Arendt among others, Mundo Nuevo, and so on. The common theme running through these journals was a defense of the intellectual, quote-unquote, in contrast to the class struggle. It was precisely from the hands of these intellectuals that the bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideas dominating the universities today arose. Foucault is seen as the father of queer theory. As the class struggle ebbed, in the wake of countless betrayals by the leaders, these ladies and gentlemen concluded that it was in fact the class struggle and the working class which was flawed and not its leadership. They merely adapted their, quote, philosophy to the interests of the bourgeoisie and labor bureaucracy. In their minds, the class struggle was dissolved into an infinite series of small individual struggles with no common characteristics. Insofar as they acknowledged the class struggle, they disparaged the alleged, quote, backwardness of the working class and called for a change in the, quote, discourse, rather than a bold lead from the cowardly leaders at the head of the movement. And we see from the CIA report, the ruling class, far from feeling threatened by any of these, quote, radical vogue ideas, welcomed them wholeheartedly as valuable tools in the ideological struggle against Marxism. So I'm going to end there for now. It's almost been an hour of reading, so I will probably break up this pamphlet into 3 parts, and I will be back again tomorrow to continue with Intersectionality and Identity Politics. And I've been reading from this text, which is a publication of the Revolutionary Communists of America, and it's called Marxism versus Identity Politics. And I believe that it is true that the military intelligence agencies of the world take absolute joy in hijacking the LGBTQ movement and weaponizing it against revolutionary movements, against Marxism, against any effective movement, and pitting them against each other on social media, especially at protests. I've seen it at the rainbow gathering, these hippie gatherings in the woods, where, one of the first trans people I ever met, I later found out had been an informant for a very long time. And these people are vulnerable, to no fault of their own. They're vulnerable to being coerced and extorted by the state. And the way that the state does this is that they will find some way to set them up and trap them, extort them, and tell them, look, if you don't become an informant for the state or a mouthpiece for the CIA to spread identity politics of a brand that is against Marxism, that is against revolutionary theory and movements, if they don't do that for the FBI or the CIA, they will be arrested, thrown in prison, and fed to sex offenders and predators. And I saw that happen in prison, where the prison guards will take a trans prisoner and tell them, on the one hand, you will be fed to a rapist if you do not become an informant. And on the other hand, if they do become an informant, they will be given their transition surgery and their hormone therapy. So they're offered the carrot or the stick. And, what can you do in that situation? A person of principles will fight, ideally, but that is a terrifying situation to be put in. And that is something that the CIA and the FBI do in America. Turkish military intelligence does the same exact thing. So, it has to be widely known that these people are very vulnerable to these dangerous situations. And, there has to be, something has to be done. So please like, share, and subscribe. I've been reading from Marxism versus Identity Politics, a publication of the Revolutionary Communists of America. And I will end this live stream in a minute. I'm going to take a break and I'll be right back, live streaming my daily routine of meditation, yoga, and martial arts.